You're listening to Tony Graham here on Binjang 91.5, and it's time for a little talk with our Mayor, Matthew Dickerson, about the Standing Committee meetings and what the outcomes of those have been. There's been some proposals that I've got before me. I'm very curious to find out the outcome. So in Studio 2 this morning, I've got Matthew Dickerson. G'day, Matthew.
I'm a bit disappointed, Tony. You said it was only a little talk with the Mayor. I was hoping for a big talk.
Hey, okay, well, great. Let's get into the big talk then.
Sure.
Now, the first thing that came to my mind was the subject came up about acquiring Market Square, which is Crown land. Now, of course, Market Square is in the middle of a housing area of Wellington. It's green space. It's also in a flood zone. So it's been looked at before by the previous council. It was quite controversial. So what's your take on that, Matthew?
So this is an idea. It's actually been happening across the state. We've actually been attending various meetings across the state where there have been or has been discussion about councils in different areas acquiring or using some land that might have been Crown land in the past, for example, or it may well have been something that was used for recreational open space. And part of the reason has been around the squeeze from a housing perspective. Sometimes it's just been land that's been sitting there not being utilised fully, so why not take advantage of that? Now, the important part here, and there's a lot of discussion at the council meeting about this and whether it was the right thing to do, the important part with this is really the first thing we're doing with this is we're saying we've identified some parcels, and then as we go through a process, we'll go to the community to get feedback from the community. And that's, I suppose, the crucial thing here. And that's why some councillors who were possibly reluctant to support this initially said that it's not a bad suggestion to at least go out and see what the community thinks about that. But if you look at that one in particular, the Market Square one, that is Crown land at the moment, and you'd be more familiar with that than I am, but it's not probably maintained to a very high standard, which obviously it costs money to do that. I'm not sure if you could tell me what things might be done there on a regular basis, how much it is utilised on a regular basis, but that's one of those parcels that we said, well, maybe this could be used for something that would be better for Wellington rather than having it sit there at the moment.
Well, I think that's one, obviously, which needs to go out to the community for consultation on, because I'm sure there'll be plenty of views. Having said that, I know that in the past it was used, in my time, quite heavily for local sport, but the local sport there was moved across and condensed into the other parks. The idea was to reduce the amount of maintenance that they had to do at the time. So anyway, we're talking about green space there, which, funnily enough, the state government's saying we need a lot more green space and we shouldn't be building on floodplains. So I don't know, but what their attitude is.
And that's really the issue here. And again, you're right, from what I know of that particular area there, it's not used for any organised sport. You might have people out there who do some casual things on it. They might walk some dogs on it, for example. But that's where we're really keen to go out there and hear what the community has to say and hear whether they think that is a reasonable thing for the council not to have in its control. And again, then we've got to go through a process to convert it from Crown land to use it for other purposes. It might be sold to a developer, there might be housing put on there, a whole range of things. But first thing is ask the community what their thoughts are in terms of that parcel of land.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Now, one of the things that was looked at, and tell me how it went, there was lots of information about the budget and things like the costs of the swimming pool usage going forward. So exactly what happened, what was the outcome of all of the budgeting section?
Yeah, so the budget...
Particularly in relation to the swimming pool and the other resources.
Yeah, so the budget was approved at the end of June, which we have to approve a budget so that staff can keep getting paid their wages from the 1st of July going forward. So that meeting happened at the end of June in terms of our extraordinary meeting for that budget approval. And so the budget that was put out on display in terms of the rate rise, the 0.7% compared to 2.3%, for example, we were given approval to go to the 2.3%. So the rates across the board, on average, will go up by about 2.3% from the previous year. Obviously, the difference there we talked about from the 0.7 to the 2.3%, that was specifically going to go towards roads. So that's about $642,000 extra to go towards roads, which sounds like a large sum of money, but roads seem to be incredibly expensive. So $642,000 will help, but it certainly won't solve the entire problem we've got with the road network and the poor quality of the road network at the moment. In general, in terms of about specific issues with Wellington, probably the pool was the main one when we did talk about returning those season passes, the family season passes, the individual season passes, returning those to pre-pandemic levels. Obviously, there was a fair bit of feedback from the community to say that that was too large a jump because the price had been essentially cut in half during the pandemic. And then the proposal initially was to take it back to those pre-pandemic levels, which effectively would mean that it would double again back to that previous rate. So the discussion from councillors taking on board that feedback from the community was to not go forward with that large jump. There was an increase put through for those season passes, those family passes, that type of thing, but they weren't put through anywhere near the level that we had originally proposed. So that was good to hear from the community, good to hear that community feedback. Again, the challenge that we've always got as councillors is it's very easy to say to someone, we're not going to put your price up, but you've then got to balance that on the flip side of that to keep providing the services that the community wants, the community needs, with less income. So that's always a juggling act there. So that might mean that the pools will generate less income, and that was across the board, Dubbo, Geary and Wellington pools. The other thing that we thought made more sense was for those passes, those season passes, for example, to be used in Dubbo or Wellington. So if you bought one of those season passes in Wellington, it means you could go to the Wellington pool or the Dubbo pool and vice versa. If we're one amalgamated council, we should be doing more of those things together rather than having distinct differences between Wellington and Dubbo. Geary is a little bit separate. The facilities there at Geary aren't at the same level as Wellington and Dubbo, so there was a different pricing structure for Geary there because of those lower levels or the lower standard of those facilities there.
Okay. Well, I think council has very well considered that, and I'm sure it will be. Their decision will be welcomed compared to what it was supposed to be in the first place. So that's, I think, very welcome. Now, there's been a quarterly report on the documents executed under the power of attorney. Now, we have previously discussed that. So that's to do with, the way the council works really from the top down, or from the very top anyway, in the modus operandi. So how's that going?
So you will note in that report there that the most important thing was that the power of attorney for the CEO has been revoked. So it was still in place from the previous council. So this particular report that you'll see here in the papers from last night, you won't see that report again going forward because, again, the CEO was given power of attorney previously. In the discussions that we had in terms of this new council, then back on the 26th of May, as part of that discussion, we revoked the power of attorney. So any decisions made after the 26th of May this year, the CEO could not use power of attorney. So that's a very important step, in my opinion, because I think that caused a lot of angst in the community that the CEO had that power of attorney, which they had for the last few years under the last council's regime. And I think there were decisions made that people felt like they didn't have the chance to have a say on, to give some feedback on. The CEO exercised his power of attorney, and the only way you had a check on that was with a report, this report that you've mentioned here, with a report that then goes through to council to say what's happened, how has that power of attorney been used, but it's too late. It's already been used, and that was one of the concerns of the council. And this has nothing to do whether or not we trust the CEO. We've got a lot of trust, a lot of faith in our CEO, Murray Wood. So there was no question that this was anything to do with the level of ability or our trust level in a CEO. It was the system, the process in place that made councillors feel a bit uncomfortable, and certainly some negative feedback from the last council where the CEO did use his power of attorney, which seemed to cut out the community in those discussions. So, yeah, the report there only had 4 items that were utilised with the power of attorney, but again, going forward now, that won't be utilised any further. You won't need to see that report coming through any further.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I mean, that does go to, what would you say, best practice in governance. And certainly I know that there's a lot of quarters in Wellington who would welcome the change there. Now, you've also been establishing new committees, town committees, and all sorts of things. So you had a code of meeting practice for those community committees and working parties. And I did notice that you've also had an amendment to terms of reference in relation to one of those. So you might like to just explain what's happening there in that space.
Certainly. So as you'd be aware, we went forward and said that the last council seemed to remove many of those consultative committees from the process in that decision-making process. And this group of councillors thought it would be much better to get feedback from the community, welcome feedback from the community. And the feedback can come from the community anytime, in any way, shape or form. But when we had those working parties, those consultative committees in the past, what I used to find personally, it was great to sit around and in a fairly informal process at a committee meeting, have discussions with community members, people that were focused on that particular area of council, and then be able to take that information forward through the standing committees of council and then finally a council resolution. It gave a bit of time for discussion, it gave good viewpoints from different areas, and you ended up with hopefully a much better decision than if council just went and did something themselves or just used a power of attorney and made a decision without really any consultation. So the idea here was certainly all going forward with that open communication, transparency, consultation, etc. We were very impressed with the number of people who came forward who wanted to be on some of those committees. And so one of the things that we modified, we had initially talked about the various committees and the committee structure and how many community members we might want on some of those committees. In some of those committees, we actually had more applications than we initially had places for. And again, in discussion with councillors, a lot of the councillors thought, well, the people coming forward, they want to be able to bring their opinion forward. It's very difficult for councillors to say who should be good or bad on those particular committees in terms of who should be on those. So some of those committees were expanded in their community representation. And I'm talking about, we might have said there should be 4 community members on a committee and we got 6 applications, rather than try and work out which of those 2 we can't include on that committee. And remember, these are people who are volunteering to be part of it. Imagine being told that you're not good enough to be a volunteer on one of our volunteer committees. So the easier process seemed to be, let's welcome that extra input from the community. And so we expanded some of those committees out to actually include the extra people that applied for those committees. So we can have those numbers, we can vary those numbers, but it was a formal council resolution, so we need to go through and formally resolve those changes there. So that was the main part there. There is a code of meeting practice which is endorsed in this process we went through, is endorsed there, or the recommendation to council is to endorse those. And that's really just about behaving sensibly, doing the right thing. It's all common sense, but sometimes you need to write down some of those rules around common sense just to be able to point to them if you need to.
Okay. And is there anything else you'd like to talk about that came out of those meetings, Matthew?
No, I think in general, they were, as with any of these meetings, it was really just that process of putting forward the next stage, putting forward the next step. It's really important that the community reads some of this information, looks at it, is vaguely aware of what's happening. The last thing that we want, and this is where I suppose councillors feel as if maybe we haven't communicated enough, if this happens, the last thing we ever want is for people to say, oh, I didn't know about that. I didn't know that was happening on council. When did that come up? How did I possibly have any way of knowing about that? And the way you know about a lot of these things is just to pay a bit of attention, keep an eye on some of these things that are happening, and really just, I suppose, be a little bit in touch with it. So I love it when people grab me on the street and talk about something that happened at a council meeting or some information that went through. It means that people are paying attention to what's going on in their council, because it's not my council, Tony, it's their council, it's your council, it's the community's council.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Matthew, for taking your time out to talk to the community of Greater Wellington and particularly on Binjang Radio. We look forward to all our communications with Council, so thank you very much for that. And now it's back to all the great music and information with Kathy Donnelly on Binjang 91.5.